When peace feels unfamiliar, restoration begins here. This is P.I.P.E Podcast. Hey, welcome back to P.I.P.E, Plug into Positive Energy. I'm your host, Kizia Mayfield. And if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm really glad you found us, and I'm so glad you're here. Before we get into today's episode, I want to say something. This podcast isn't surface level. We don't do small talk around here. We come in, we sit down, and we tell the truth, because I genuinely believe healing begins when truth becomes safer than silence. So that's exactly what we're going to do today. Pull up a chair, get comfortable, because this one is personal. This conversation has been sitting inside of me for a while, and I think it's finally time. The title of today's episode is Maybe I Was Never the Problem. I want you to just sit with those words before I explain what they mean. Maybe I was never the problem, because somewhere along the way, someone or something taught you to believe that you were. It taught you that when things went wrong, when people left, when conflict showed up, the most logical explanation was you. That something inside of you was broken, that you were too much, or maybe not enough. So you carried that story. You got quiet when you wanted to speak. You made yourself smaller when you actually needed more space. You left before you could be left. You solved problems that were never yours to solve, because somewhere, probably as a little child, you decided the safest thing you could do was remove yourself from the equation. Today, I want to talk about where that story comes from, how it quietly shapes our relationships, what it costs you, what it looks like to finally choose a different story. Let's get into it. So, I want to start by telling you what happened this week, because this episode didn't come from a sermon I heard or a book I read. It came from a week that just pushed me in the best way possible. The kind of push that's uncomfortable, but it's also incredibly clarifying. This week and last week, I've had so many conversations, real conversations with my children, with Darius, and honestly, some of the most important conversations were the ones I had by myself. Just sitting quietly, thinking about my parents, thinking about how I grew up, thinking about what was modeled for me. Not because the people who raised me were necessarily bad people. They weren't. They were human. They were imperfect. And like all of us, they probably did the best they could with what they had. But sometimes the best someone has to give still isn't enough to teach you some things that you desperately needed to learn. As I look back over my life, I started noticing patterns in my relationships, patterns in the way I respond to conflict, patterns in what happens inside of me when there's tension and distance or misunderstanding. And this week, I noticed something I had never really seen before. There was a thread, a common denominator. But it wasn't my circumstances. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't even the other people. It was a story A story I'd been carrying for so long, I didn't even recognize it as a story anymore. I thought it was just simply the truth. And that story was this: I am the problem. And I have a feeling that I'm not the only one who believes something like that. If you've been listening to P.I.P.E for any length of time, or you've done any real honest healing work, you probably found your own version of that story. Maybe yours sounds like I'm too much, or people always leave me, or I ruin everything. Or maybe it's, if I hadn't been so, you fill in the blank. That's the story. And stories like that run deep. But before I tell you where mine came from, I want to tell you about a moment that happened this week, because it was one ordinary moment that brought all of this right to the surface. I've done a lot of healing work. I want to be honest about that. I've had to. Life required it over the years. I've named fears. I've confronted patterns. I've had conversations that cost me something. And honestly, I thought I knew my wounds pretty well by now. But this week, I realized something. There's a difference between knowing a wound exists and actually understanding how deep it goes. For a long time, I thought my deepest wound was rejection. I believed everything came back to abandonment, to people leaving, to not being chosen. That's the story I told myself for years. But this week, I realized something. It wasn't rejection. Not really. It was something even deeper. I believed the reason people left, the reason conflict happened, the reason relationships fell apart was me. I wasn't just afraid people would reject me. I had quietly come to believe that they should, that I was the common denominator, that if enough relationships became difficult, eventually the answer had to be me. I thought I was the problem. And when you carry a belief like that, it becomes the lens you see everything through. Someone raises their voice and you don't think they're just having a hard day. You immediately wonder, what did I do? Someone gets quiet and instead of thinking they probably just need some space, you think, I've done it again. Someone walks away and you don't stop to ask what happened. You already think you know the answer. It was me. It's always me. That's such a heavy way to live, because beliefs like this don't announce themselves. They don't introduce themselves by saying, "Hi, I'm the lie you believe since you were a little girl." They don't work like that. They become so familiar, they stop feeling like a story and they start feeling like reality. You don't question them anymore. You just live from them. Until one day, something happens that cracks the story open. For me, that happened on a golf course. Darius and I were having like a regular day. Nothing dramatic, nothing out of the ordinary. We were out on the course and Darius was playing golf. Now, if you know anything about golfers, you know golf can be an emotional sport. It's a game where you have a lot of time between shots to think about the last bad one. And Darius, he loves this game and takes it pretty seriously. And because he takes it seriously, there are moments where frustration comes out. So he hits a shot and it doesn't go the way he wanted. He says something out loud. He's frustrated, maybe a little sharp. It's not at me. It's not even directed at me. Just at that moment. And then something happened inside my body. I felt it before I even had a thought. My chest tightened, my stomach dropped. Something inside of me went on high alert. That familiar electric feeling that I now recognize as my nervous system saying danger. It's the same feeling I get when conflict shows up. The same feeling that used to make me go quiet, go small, go away. And my very first thought, automatic, immediate, without a single piece of evidence, was, what did I do? Immediately, I started scanning. Did I say something wrong? Did I distract him? Is he upset with me? My brain immediately went to work, building a case for why, once again, I must be the source of the problem. Even though Darius hadn't said one word to me, even though there wasn't any conflict between us, even though all that had happened was a grown man missing a golf shot and expressing frustration to no one in particular. But here's what made that moment different. And this is why I'm telling you that story. I caught it. I actually heard myself. I felt the spiral starting. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't follow it. Instead, I talked myself through it right there in that moment, quietly, almost like I was coaching myself from the inside. Kizia, he's not upset with you. He's frustrated with the shot. That's his frustration, not your failure. You didn't cause this. You don't have to fix it. You're okay. And I then was able to choose connection instead of retreat. I didn't pull away. I didn't get quiet. I didn't start managing my distance. I didn't begin calculating how to make myself smaller so I could just wait for the tension to pass. I just stayed. And do you know what happened? That moment moved on, just like moments do when we don't turn them into something that they were never meant to be. Afterward, I just sat with it because I recognized something. That moment wasn't really about golf. It was about a pattern I had deeply ingrained, an automatic pattern that had been running inside of me for a very, very long time. And I knew if I was ever going to be free from it, I had to understand where it came from. Now, I want to pause here because I think this is important. Part of healing, real healing, not just the kind that makes you feel good in the moment, is learning to be accountability to reality. Not your interpretation of reality, not to the story your nervous system is trying to tell you, but to what is actually happening. What was actually happening on that golf course was this. My husband missed a shot and he was frustrated. That's it. That's the whole story. But what my nervous system was telling me was a completely different story. It was telling me that the frustration pointed at me, that I had done something wrong, that I was in danger, relational danger, and I needed to either fix it or flee. That gap between reality and interpretation That's where so much unnecessary pain lives. Because when we confuse someone's frustration with rejection, we respond to something that isn't even there. We have arguments that haven't started yet. We create distance to protect ourselves from abandonment that isn't coming. We leave in 100 small ways before we can be asked to leave. And the relationship pays for it. And so does our soul. But in that moment, I made a different choice. I chose to look at what was real. I chose to stay grounded in what I knew about my husband, who he was, how he loves, what his frustration actually looks like, rather than what my old story was insisting was true. That's accountability, not the kind that beats you up, the kind that grounds you, the kind that says, look at what is real. Choose your response from here. And choosing from there, choosing connection, choosing to stay, that is where healing actually shows up in real life. Not in a therapy session, not on a journal page, but in the ordinary, unremarkable moments when your old story tries to run the show and you decide quietly but firmly that you don't live there anymore. But to understand why the story started in the first place, I had to go back. My dad was a pastor, and I want to say that with love because I do love my father, and I have a deep respect for the calling and for the work that he did. But I also want to say it with honesty because being a pastor's child comes with its own particular landscape, its own particular pressures, its own particular lessons about who you're supposed to be and what your presence is supposed to cost you. One of the things I experienced growing up was that we moved a lot. Every 12 to 18 months, we would pick up and go somewhere new. A new church, a new community, a new city, new schools, new friends. Every time. Now, as a child, you don't have a framework for that. You don't sit down and rationally process that this move is about church leadership and ministry decisions, and it has nothing to do with my relationships or my worth. You don't do that. What you do is feel. And I felt over and over again, it ends. Whatever I build here, it ends. And here's the part that really shaped me. The leaving was rarely peaceful. It wasn't, we had a beautiful season here and God is calling us somewhere new. It was often and too often filled with conflict, tension in the church, disagreements that couldn't be resolved. And the response to that conflict was to leave. So what did I learn? I learned several things, and I learned them deeply, the way that children do, not from being taught, but from watching, from absorbing. I learned that conflict means the end of a relationship. I learned that when times or things get hard, you go. I learned that the way you handle a problem is by removing yourself from it. And I learned, most dangerously, that if the conflict was happening around you, if you were somewhere in the orbit of it, you were probably at least part of the cause. I was a child. I didn't have words for any of this, but I filed it. My nervous system filed it with meticulous, detailed precision, and I built a strategy around those lessons, a survival strategy. And that survival strategy looked like this. Don't get too attached. Don't go too deep. Keep your options open. When it gets hard, you leave first. And when you can't figure out what went wrong, assume it was you. That strategy kept me safe for a long time, or at least it kept me from feeling certain kinds of pain. But it also kept me from something else, something that I didn't even realize I was missing until so much later. It kept me from staying. When you grow up learning that leaving is an answer to a conflict, you find very creative ways to never have to stay through the hard part. For me, one of those ways was my friendships. I always had multiple groups of friends. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about being social or well-connected. I'm talking about a deliberate, almost unconscious strategy of never going deep enough with any one group. That losing them would devastate me. If things got complicated in one group, I could just flow to another. If conflict came up, if someone misunderstood me, if things started to feel too hard or uncomfortable, I had somewhere else to go. I was never without options. And at the time, that felt like safety, but what it actually was a way to avoid ever learning how to repair, because repair requires staying. Repair requires sitting in the disruption and the discomfort of a rupture and choosing not to run. It requires believing that the relationship can survive what just happened, that conflict is not necessarily a death sentence, that misunderstandings are not the end. I never learned that. I never had to, because I always left before we got there. And here's what it did to me. Over time, it reinforced the story. Every time I left a relationship or a friendship before it got hard, I told myself I was protecting myself. But what I was actually doing was confirming the belief. See, you can't stay. See, things always fall apart. See, it's better not to get close. I was building evidence for a case that was never true. And I carried every single piece of it right into my marriage. Marriage is a terrifying place to bring an unexamined survival strategy, because marriage doesn't let you have 5 backup friend groups. Marriage doesn't allow you to gracefully drift away when it gets hard. Marriage is one person, one home, one life that you've decided to build together. And when conflict comes, and it always comes, there's nowhere to redirect. You have to stay or you have to go. And for me, going was the only option I'd ever really practiced. The first time Darius and I had a real conflict, the kind that didn't resolve in an hour, the kind that sits heavy between two people and demands something from both of them, I did what I always had done. I said, I'm leaving. Usually in a dramatic way, and there's maybe some screaming. There was just this definite, settled, like it was the only logical conclusion. Like I have done the math and this was the answer. And I got in my car and I drove. for hours. And here's what I want you to understand about what was happening inside of me during that time. I wasn't angry, or at least anger wasn't the primary thing. What I was relieved because I had done it. I had removed the problem. I had separated myself from the conflict. I had taken away the source of the difficulty, which in my mind, in that old story, was me. Think about that for a moment. I genuinely believed that by leaving, I was doing Darius a favor. I believed that conflict would resolve itself once I was out of the equation, because I was the equation. I was what was wrong. And that is not the story of a woman who's struggling with conflict resolution. That is a story of a woman who has believed for most of her life that she is fundamentally too much of a problem to stay. The survival strategy that was designed to protect me had over time became a belief about my worth, and I was acting it out in the most important relationship of my life. That night, sitting in my car somewhere on the road, I had driven away to get away. I didn't have all of the language yet, and I didn't have the clarity I have now. But something inside of me was asking a question that I just couldn't answer. If I leave every time, what am I building? I want to talk about my husband, because part of this story, a big part, is about what consistency does to a wound like mine, what it does to a person who's been rehearsing conflict equals ending for 30-something years. What happens when someone refuses to confirm the story that you've been telling yourself? Darius stayed. That sounds simple, and it is simple in the best way possible. It's profoundly, earth-shakingly simple. When I left, he didn't let the leaving be the period at the end of the sentence. He called, he checked in, and he said, "Baby, come home." Not in a controlling way, not in a demanding way that communicated something my whole system had never received before. Your leaving doesn't end this. I'm still here. Come home. And the first time he did this, I didn't trust it. I'm going to be honest with you. I heard it as manipulation. I heard it as some kind of tactic, because in the only story I knew, staying after conflict was not something people did. It didn't make sense to me. It felt suspect. But he kept doing it consistently, not perfectly. I mean, Darius is human, and we've had all kinds of seasons. But the through line was consistent. He did not let me rewrite our marriage as a story that ended every time I reached for the door. And slowly, not overnight, not in a single moment of revelation, but slowly something started to shift inside of me. I started to realize that conflict between us didn't have to mean the end, that we could have a rupture and come back, that we could disagree deeply and still find each other on the other side, that I could be frustrated and he could be frustrated, and we didn't have to be afraid of each other's emotions. That it's not a small thing for someone who grew up believing that conflict was the announcement of a goodbye, learning that conflict can actually be the doorway to deeper connection, that rewrites everything. Darius didn't heal me. I want to be clear about that. Healing is work that I can only do, and God had to walk me through most of it. But Darius gave me something to practice against. His consistency gave me evidence that challenged the story. His commitment gave me space to stay instead of go. And in staying and choosing over and over not to leave, I started to heal something I hadn't even fully named yet. This week, I watched my daughter tell the truth. And I don't mean something dramatic, and I don't mean she made some grand confession. I just mean she said something honest about how she was feeling, about something that had bothered her. And she said it clearly, without guarding it, without softening it to past the point of meaning, without making herself small to manage everyone else's reaction. She just said it. And then something beautiful happened. She got lighter. I watched it happen. I watched the weight of the held thing lift off of her as soon as she put it down out in the open. As soon as she trusted that the truth could be said and that the relationship would hold and that the people around her would not disappear because she told them something so real, she didn't need to calculate and she didn't need to strategize. She didn't need to figure out which version of the truth was safe enough to say. She just said the true thing. And the world didn't end. And I sat with that for a moment, for a pretty long time this week, because I know what it took to get there. I know that version of me who raised this child, the early version, the one who was still deep in her own survival patterns, the one who would not have always created space for that. I know that healing in me had to happen for space to open up for her. And I also know that what she experienced, the lightness that comes from telling the truth and being held anyway, is exactly what I want to give her for the rest of her life. Not just in the moments when the truth is easy, but especially in the moments when it isn't. I want her to grow up knowing that truth doesn't end relationships, that conflict is not a countdown to goodbye, that misunderstanding is not the same as rejection, that she is not, she was never, she will never be the problem. Because if I can give her that, if I can actually genuinely give her a childhood where truth is safer than silence and love is not conditional on performance, then the chain breaks. The patterns that traveled through my family for generations, through the secrets and the silence and leaving, it does not have to travel through her. And that is worth every hard, uncomfortable, painful, necessary piece of work I have ever done. I want to build a home that is safe. Not perfect. I gave up on perfect a long time ago. And thank God, because perfect was never available anyway. But safe. Safe, I can work toward. Safe, I can choose every single day. Safe means that in our home, you can say the hard things and still be loved. You can mess up and still belong. You can be afraid and say so. You can be angry and say so. You can change your mind and nobody will use it against you. You can have a bad day without it becoming the defining story of who you are. Safe means that conflict is allowed to happen and repair is expected to follow. Not because we're perfect at it, not because we always do it gracefully, but because we've decided as a family that the relationship is worth more than the comfort of avoiding those really hard conversations. Safe means that the truth can live here, that you don't have to carry it alone, that you don't have to protect yourself by going silent, by going small, by going away. I didn't grow up in a home that felt safe in that way. And I don't say that to assign blame. I say it to name it. What was missing so that I can now intentionally build what I never had. Because here's what I've learned. You can break a generational pattern. It doesn't happen automatically. And it doesn't happen because you want it to. It happens because you do the work, the real work, the uncomfortable work, the unglamorous work, the years-long work of choosing differently, of catching yourself when the old story starts running again, of building new evidence of one small moment at a time. Darius and I are building that imperfectly, messily, faithfully. And my daughter, the one who told the truth this last week and got lighter, she is now living inside of that. She is building evidence right now that the world is safe enough for her honesty. And that is the most important thing I've ever done. I want to end by coming back to where we started. Maybe I was never the problem, because here's what I've come to understand. The little girl who decided she was the problem, she wasn't wrong to decide it. She was doing the only thing a little girl can do when her world keeps changing and the reasons never get explained to her. She was making meaning. She was looking at the evidence in front of her and building the most logical story she could find. Things keep ending. I keep being there when they end. I must be why they end. This is not a bad child. This is a smart child. A child who was trying to make sense of a world that wasn't making sense to her. A child who was trying to find some way to feel in control of an environment that kept pulling the ground out from under her feet. She wasn't a problem. She was a little girl who needed someone to stay, who needed someone to say, this conflict is not about you. This ending is not because of you. You are not the common denominator. You are not the reason. She needed to grow up in a home where truth was safe and repair was practiced, and leaving wasn't the default answer to hard things. She didn't get that. So she built a story to explain the world that she actually lived in. And that story became her lens. And that lens became her pattern. And that pattern walked with her all the way into adulthood, into friendship, into marriage, into motherhood, until life asked her to look at it. That little girl is me. And maybe, just maybe, some version of her is you. Maybe you're the one who's been carrying the story that you're too much or not enough or that the reason things fall apart is something fundamental about who you are. Maybe you've been leaving in all the small, quiet ways that people leave, because somewhere along the way, you decided that the most loving thing you could do was removing the problem. But what if the problem was never you? What if it was just a little girl who learned the only way she knew how to survive? And survive so well that nobody ever stopped to teach her a different way. You can learn a different way. It's not too late. It was never too late. The story changes when you decide it changes. Not all at once, not perfectly, but one honest moment at a time. One choice to stay instead of go. One conversation where you say the true thing and you discover the world doesn't end. That's how it starts. That's how it started for me. I want to end by coming back to where we started. Maybe I was never the problem, because here's what I've come to understand. The little girl who decided she was the problem, she wasn't wrong to decide it. She was doing the only thing a little girl can do when her world keeps changing and the reasons never get explained to her. She was making meaning. She was looking at the evidence in front of her and building the most logical story she could find. Things keep ending. I keep being there when they end. I must be why they end. This is not a bad child. This is a smart child. A child who was trying to make sense of a world that wasn't making sense to her. A child who was trying to find some way to feel in control of an environment that kept pulling the ground out from under her feet. She wasn't a problem. She was a little girl who needed someone to stay, who needed someone to say, this conflict is not about you. This ending is not because of you. You are not the common denominator. You are not the reason. She needed to grow up in a home where truth was safe and repair was practiced, and leaving wasn't the default answer to hard things. She didn't get that. So she built a story to explain the world that she actually lived in. And that story became her lens. And that lens became her pattern. And that pattern walked with her all the way into adulthood, into friendship, into marriage, into motherhood, until life asked her to look at it. That little girl is me. And maybe, just maybe, some version of her is you. Maybe you're the one who's been carrying the story that you're too much or not enough, or that the reason things fall apart is something fundamental about who you are. Maybe you've been leaving in all the small, quiet ways that people leave, because somewhere along the way, you decided that the most loving thing you could do was removing the problem. But what if the problem was never you? What if it was just a little girl who learned the only way she knew how to survive? And survive so well that nobody ever stopped to teach her a different way. You can learn a different way. It's not too late. It was never too late. The story changes when you decide it changes. Not all at once, not perfectly, but one honest moment at a time. one choice to stay instead of go, one conversation where you say the true thing and you discover the world doesn't end. That's how it starts. That's how it started for me. Thank you for listening today. Thank you for sitting with this. I know it wasn't easy. Some of this stuff never is. But I believe with everything in me that the conversations that we're willing to have with ourselves are the ones that set us free. If something in this episode spoke to you, or you heard yourself in any part of the story, I want to encourage you to sit with it, write it down, pray through it, talk to someone you trust, because you don't have to carry it alone anymore. You never did. If you're not already following the podcast, please subscribe wherever you listen, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and leave us a review. If this episode meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. You never know who in your life is quietly carrying a story that doesn't belong to them. You can also connect with us at crownsrestored.com and on TikTok. Until next time, remember, healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens one honest conversation, one brave choice, and one step at a time. I'll see you next week. Thank you for sitting with us today, where restoration begins.